After 30 years of keeping it a secret, Ray Charles finally opened a vault full of unreleased songs that would change the course of music history in 2009. Inside were lost recordings, forgotten duets, and a mysterious compilation that Ray himself had put together. But that wasn't the craziest part. A letter from Johnny Cash revealed the shocking truth about what Ray had been planning the whole time. Ray Charles was born on September 23, 1930, in Albany, Georgia, during one of the worst times in American history, the Great Depression. For a poor black family in the segregated South, life was even harder. His father wasn't around much, so his mother, Artha, raised him by herself. She was still a teenager and worked long hours as a laundress to make money. When Ray was 6 months old, she moved with him to Greenville, Florida, hoping for a better life, but they fell into poverty. In his autobiography, he later wrote that they were at the bottom of all the struggling families. Artha was tough. She didn't have a choice. She wouldn't let Ray, no matter how bad things got. She taught him that life would never be easy and that he had to be strong. That way of thinking became a part of him and shaped how he dealt with every problem that came his way. Then, when Ray was 5, he never got over what happened when his little brother George fell into a washtub full of water while they were playing outside. Ray saw it happen and tried to help, but as a child, it was too late. George was gone. That event stayed with Ray for a long time. As if that loss wasn't hard enough, around the same time Ray started losing his sight. At first it was just blurry vision, but it got worse, and by the time he was 7, he was completely blind. The cause was glaucoma, a condition that could have been treated if his family had access to good medical care, but they didn't. His eye hurt so badly that doctors had to take it out completely. Arha didn't let him feel sorry for himself. She wouldn't let him depend on other people for anything. She told him, "You're blind but you ain't dumb," which meant he had no reason to give up. She made him do chores and find his own way around. She pushed him to be independent because she knew the world wouldn't be kind to him. It was survival. He never used a cane or a guide dog, even when he was famous, because he didn't want people to see him as helpless. Some people didn't believe he was blind because he moved across the stage so smoothly. They whispered that maybe he could see more than he let on, but the truth was that his mother had trained him so well that he made it look easy. Ray Charles was only 7 years old when he started at the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind in 1937. At first, it felt like a different world to him because he missed home, and some kids made fun of him because he was poor. He got up barefoot, which made the teasing worse, but that didn't stop him. He threw himself into his studies and most of all music. Learning music in Braille wasn't easy. He had to read a few notes at a time, memorize them, and then move on. This helped him develop a strong memory and a deep understanding of music later in life. He said that learning music this way changed the way his mind worked. He could picture whole arrangements in his head without ever touching a piano, which set him apart from most people. Black students at the time were given old Braille books and used school supplies. The conditions were unfair, but Ray made the best of what he had. Music was his escape, and he learned classical pieces by Bach and Chopin. But that was only one part of his education. Before he went to school, Ray fell in love with music back home in Greenville, where a shopkeeper named Y. Pittman let him play the piano whenever he wanted. Pittman's jukebox played songs by Nat King Cole, Count Basie, and others. When Ray first got to school, he was already trying out different types of music at assemblies. He mixed classical pieces with popular songs, showing that he wasn't going to stick to just one genre. Every Saturday night he listened to the Grand Ole Opry and enjoyed the twang of country music. He loved gospel for its raw emotion, blues for its soul, and jazz for its freedom. This mix of styles would later shape his whole career. During his 8 years at the school, he learned to play the piano and mastered other instruments. At the time, black students didn't usually get this kind of musical training, but Ray made the most of it. He also joined the school chorus, which helped him improve both his singing and his instrumental skills. By age 12, he was writing his own music and arranging full band pieces from memory. His teachers knew he had something special. Life at the school wasn't always about music. Black students had to do hard work to help support the institution. As a reminder of the world he grew up in, sewing bands around straw brooms didn't break his spirit. In fact, it made him more determined to succeed. Then, in 1945, everything changed. His mother died suddenly at just 31 years old. She had been his biggest supporter and the person who pushed him to be independent. Without her, Ray felt lost. He tried to keep going to school, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. That same year he pulled a prank on a teacher and got kicked out. His education was over. Ray Charles made a choice that would change his life at age 16, dotted with 1,948, and he had just lost both parents. He had been blind since he was 7 years old. He got on a bus in Tampa, Florida and headed for Seattle. The trip took 5 days and he barely had any money, but he was determined to start over. He wanted to get as far away from his past as possible and find new opportunities. Seattle was full of music in the Central District, and Pioneer Square had more than 30 packed jazz clubs. With musicians who had been in war bands during WRI, the competition was tough, but that's what made it fun. It was the perfect place for a young musician trying to make a name for himself. Not long after arriving, Charles met Quincy Jones, who was already a musician, and the two of them hit it off right away. Jones couldn't believe how independent Charles was, living alone, cooking for himself, and even fixing his own record player. They played music together for hours, pushing each other creatively and learning from each other in ways that would shape both of their futures. Charles started playing in clubs like the Rocking Chair and the Black Elks Club with his first band, the Maxon Trio, named after him and guitarist Gussie McKee. It was the first time he had steady gigs and a community that welcomed him. Years later he would say, "Seattle is the town where I made my first record, and if you..." In 1949, Charles recorded Confession Blues with his band, but the record label mistakenly listed them as the Maxine Trio instead of the Maxon Trio. The song became a big hit, reaching number 2 on the R&B charts, which later became known as Swingtime Records. The style was a smooth mix of jazz and blues that was heavily influenced by Nat King Cole and Charles Brown. In those early days, Charles was still copying the artists he looked up to. A music executive named Jack Lauderdale saw Charles perform at the Rocking Chair and knew he had something special. He set up a recording session right away with Confession Blues, and the two of them recorded I Love You as the Bide. At just 18 years old, Charles had a national hit, but he was still using his full name, Ray Charles Robinson. As he became more famous though, people started confusing him with Sugar Ray Robinson, the famous boxer. To avoid this, he changed his name to he dropped his last name and became Ray Charles. It was a small change that made a big difference. He now had a name that stood on its own. In 1952, Ray Charles signed with Atlantic Records. Ahmed Egan saw something special in him and bought out his contract from Swingtime Records for $2,500, which is about $228,600 today. That deal changed everything. Charles was talented, but he was still finding his own sound. He looked up to artists like Nat King Cole and Charles Brown, and you could hear it in his music. Atlantic, on the other hand, gave him a new sound. They let him try new things and found his own voice. His first recording session with the label was in September 1952 in New York City. He recorded Roll With My Baby and The Midnight Hour. These songs showed promise, but they weren't game changers yet. He was still changing. Over the next few years, everything about his music would change. His voice would get rougher and more powerful. His piano playing would get bolder, and soon he would find his own voice. Atlantic not only signed Charles, but also helped him grow as a musician by letting him take risks, push the limits, and mix genres in ways that no one else was. By the time he left in 1959, he had mastered a sound that mixed gospel, jazz, and blues into a new style that people would soon call soul music. His time with Atlantic wasn't just about making hits, it was about changing music forever. The turning point came in 1954, when he recorded I Got a Woman. It wasn't like any other song on the radio. It had the raw emotion of gospel music, the swing of jazz, and the grit of rhythm and blues. He co-wrote it with trumpeter Reynold Richard, getting ideas from the gospel song It Must Be Jesus. They recorded it in Atlanta on November 18, 1954, and by January 1955, it had reached number 1 on the R&B charts. It was more than just a hit, it was one of the first true soul songs. Then, in 1956, he recorded Hallelujah I Love Her, which had a bright happy energy. The song went to number 5 on the R&B charts, showing that Charles wasn't just a great musician, he was also making something new. But his biggest break came by accident in December 1958 at a live show in Brownsville, Pennsylvania. He ran out of songs before the end of his set, but he still had 12 minutes to fill, so he started playing a rhythm on his electric piano. His band followed along and his backup singers played rets that went with every line he sang like a... The crowd couldn't get enough of Charles's performance. He knew he had something special. Over the next few months, he worked on the song, and on February 18, 1959, he recorded it. As I said, the energy was electric, the rhythm was hypnotic, and the call and response between Charles and the Rets made it feel alive. There was only one problem: the song was too long for a single record. So Atlantic had to split it into two parts, one for each side of the vinyl. That didn't stop it from becoming a huge hit. It sold over 1 million copies. At the time, it was almost unheard of for a black artist to get to #1 on the R&B charts and #6 on the Billboard Hot 100. Charles's use of call and response became one of his trademarks. It wasn't just backup singing, it was part of the song's energy. He brought the tradition of gospel choirs into secular music. The Rets didn't just harmonize behind him, they answered him and pushed the song forward. This technique became a signature of soul music and has influenced generations of artists. In 1960, Ray Charles signed a record deal with ABC Paramount Records that changed everything. At the time, this was unheard of. He would own his master recordings, which wasn't something even the biggest stars had. He also got a $50,000 annual advance, which is worth more than $500,000 today, and higher royalties than he was getting at Atlantic Records. This deal wasn't just a win for Charles, it was a turning point for black musicians fighting for equal rights. Charles made sure he would keep making money from his music for years to come by owning his masters. This type of deal gave artists power and set a new standard in the industry. But for Charles, it wasn't just about business, he also wanted the freedom to try out new sounds and ideas. His first big hit under ABC, Georgia on My Mind, in 1960, won 2 Grammy Awards and went on to become the official state song of Georgia. It was the start of something bigger. In later years, Charles took a risk that no one saw coming when he released new sounds in country and western music in 1962. At the time, it was very rare for a black artist to record country music. Country was seen as a white genre, and the music industry kept those two worlds separate. But Charles never cared about boundaries. He mixed country classics with soul, jazz, and R&B, creating something completely new. Fans weren't sure what to think at first, but when I Can't Stop Loving You hit the airwaves, they were blown away. The song stayed at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 for 5 weeks, and the album went gold after selling over 500,000 copies in just 3 months. It was one of the best-selling albums by a black artist at the time, and Rolling Stone later called it one of the best albums ever made. But back then, it was more than just a success. It was a statement that Charles had shown that music could break down barriers by making a genre divided by race universal. At the same time, Charles was putting out hit after hit. Georgia on My Mind was Ray Charles's first #1 single, and in 1961 Hit the Road Jack was his second. The song was written by Percy Mayfield, and Charles and the Ret had an unforgettable back and forth that was both playful and powerful. The song went to #1 and won a Grammy for Best Rhythm and Blues Recording. It became one of his most famous songs, and people all over the world still play and love it. Ray Charles's life was as crazy as his music. His voice was smooth, but his personal life anything but marriage. His first marriage to E. Williams in 1951 lasted less than a year, and his second marriage to Delabae Howard Robinson in 1955 lasted more than 20 years before it ended in 1977 because of drug abuse and cheating. Charles had 12 children with 10 different women. His son Ray Charles Robinson Jr. was born during his marriage to Delabae Robinson, and his son Charles Wayne Hendrick was born from his relationship with Margie Hendrick, a member of the Ret and one of his most famous lovers for years. He was always moving from one city to the next, leaving behind relationships that never had time to settle down. In 2002, when he realized his time was running out, he got all 12 of his children together for a luncheon and told them he had a terminal illness. He also made sure they would be taken care of by setting up trust funds and giving each child $500,000. It was his way of making up for the time he had spent chasing other things in his life. Charles never let anything slow him down, not even death. He lost all of his sight by age 7, but he refused to live a cautious life. He loved cars and would drive them on private roads just for the thrill of it. His son remembered him driving a '63 Corvette and wrecking it because he misjudged the clutch and pulled into an intersection. That didn't stop him. He also rode motorcycles and said he knew how to land an airplane in an emergency. Whether that was true or not, it fit the way he lived. If something seemed impossible, he wanted to try it. He tried marijuana for the first time when he was 18 years old because he thought it would help musicians be more creative. He then switched to heroin and used it for 17 years. His addiction followed him. He was arrested 3 times. In 1955, when drugs and drug paraphernalia were found backstage. In 1958, he was caught again on a Harlem street corner, and in 1961, he was caught in an Indiana hotel room with heroin and marijuana, which he said he had been using since he was 16. However, the charges were dropped because of the way the evidence was presented. He got clean, but his addiction got worse. In 1964, he was arrested again at Boston's Logan Airport. This time, he decided he was done. He checked himself into St. Francis Hospital in Linwood, California, and went through 4 terrible days of withdrawal. When he went before the judge, his psychiatrist spoke for him and told him how determined he was to quit. The judge made him a deal. If he stayed clean and got regular checkups, he would not go to prison. Charles took the offer, and he never touched heroin again. Instead, he put all of his energy into music. He recorded songs about his struggle on his first album after rehab called Crying Time, A New Beginning. He had beaten heroin, but he needed something else to keep his mind sharp, so he found chess. His psychiatrist taught him how to play while he was in rehab, and Charles became hooked. He used a special board with raised squares and holes for the pieces, feeling his way through each move. When asked if anyone had ever tried to cheat him, he laughed. "I'm going to show you that he played against strong opponents, such as Grandmaster Larry Evans." During one game, Evans set a trap for Charles in the hopes that Charles wouldn't notice.